In this video, I'll introduce you to plain language. The idea that the burden of understanding is on the writer is a recent one in Western culture. I suppose it's been gaining traction slowly over the centuries since democracy was born in ancient Greece. For most of Western history, the burden has been on the reader. For instance, did you know that the legal courts in Great Britain continued to use French up to 1731, despite the fact that English had been returned to its official status in every other aspect of British life 400 years earlier? Did you know that in Japan, most laws are still written in Chinese? They've only recently begun to be translated into Japanese. These facts certainly reflect the attitude that the burden of understanding was or is on the reader, not the writer. If you wanted to understand a legal trial in England in 1700, you had to learn French or have an attorney who served as your interpreter. Likewise, if you want to understand a Japanese law, you have to read Chinese. Over the centuries, many have tried to place the burden on the writer. Even King Edward VI in 16th century England asked that, quote, "the superfluous and tedious statutes be made more plain and short so that men might better understand them." End of his quote. In 1939 in the U.S., a Yale professor named Fred Rodell published a book proposing that every law be, quote, "written so that its meaning is plain for all to read." End of quote. I won't do justice to all that could be said about the many ways people have tried to implement reader-focused writing, also called plain language. Instead, I'll summarize them by mentioning examples of 4 different approaches. Of course, laws, regulations like the Plain Language Act of 2010, standards like ISO 24495-1, and guides like the Microsoft Writing Style Guide are all a means of encouraging writers to put readers first. Because plain language is not something taught in formal educational settings, except for a few university-level technical or business writing courses, most writers need training in order to comply with laws or guides. And it's important to understand that training is both expensive and comes with no guarantee that every employee will become willing and able to create plain language messages. That means organizations have looked for more cost-effective tools. Something like acrolinks, for example. I'll teach you about some of these in other videos. One technical writing standard I mentioned briefly in the video on style guides is called S1000D, also called Simplified Technical English. Before the 1980s, everyone in the world had to read and understand English to maintain aircraft. Simplified Technical English was developed to improve readability of those manuals for non-native English speakers. It also now aids translation of those manuals, and not only in aircraft or aerospace. Translation was time-consuming and expensive and resulted in several life-threatening mistakes. I'll say a little more about S1000D when I teach you about sentence construction and word style. For now, I'll just note one U.S. law, the Plain Writing Act of 2010. Several states in the U.S. also have laws requiring consumer contracts to be written in plain language to make it easier for consumers to understand. Plain language efforts aren't confined to English, or to law, or even government. In 2023, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, released a plain language standard, ISO 24495-1. Here's the definition from that standard. I want to spend a few minutes teasing apart the guidelines in that standard. The first guideline is that readers must get what they need. I'll use the Center for Plain Language's explanation of what's required to meet these guidelines. They say, the writer begins by identifying and describing the target audience. In other words, a writer has to know who they are and are not creating a message for, what that audience wants to do with the information in the message, and what that audience needs to know in order to get that information. Often, succeeding at this phase requires a writer to get outside their own head, talk to or research their target audience. Plain Writing Act of 2010 finally made it law that the U.S. government is required to communicate with its citizens in plain language. Since then, the Center for Plain Language asks writing experts to evaluate how well federal agencies comply with that law every year. Here's their 2020 federal report card, which focused on coronavirus information. The center provides an assessment of the messages they review, like this one from the Department of Commerce, where a business person might look for information about the CARES Act, for example. The judges noted several items that made this page an example of what not to do to achieve plain language. The main point is that the message is focused on the writer's organization instead of the reader's. For example, the agency name appeared 15 times on that page, while the word "you" never appeared once. Overall, there's little evidence that visitors to this web page would get what they need. The second guideline is that readers must easily find what they need. That means the message must be structured so that it leads the audience to what they want quickly. Most people call this aspect of a message its findability. The design of the message must also provide signposts to help readers move through the information quickly. Comments from judges at the center about this page from the Department of Commerce site included that headings are both abstract and irrelevant to readers. Also, the extremely long list of bullet points serves like a laundry list that the audience has to organize for itself. That's evidence that it won't be easy for the audience to find what they need. The third guideline is that readers must easily understand what they find. So that means the language must be clear to the intended audience. The comments from center judges about this page is that the jargon and acronyms will not be understood by readers. Just as important, the writer never addresses the audience directly by using "you." All of this gives us more evidence that it won't be easy for the audience to understand what they find on the Commerce site. The final guideline is that readers must easily use what they find. The only way to be certain a message is usable is to test it. There's little doubt that the Department of Commerce site omitted this phase of the process in creating this message. Let me briefly summarize what Leslie O'Flahaven teaches writers about text elements associated with plain language in her LinkedIn Learning course. First, structure or organization matters. In particular, it's vital to begin with a main point, what I call the bottom line message. Second, design matters, or visible structure matters. The use of visual elements like headings, bullets, and tables make messages more clear. Third, wording matters. Style, conciseness. Leslie provides a list of 6 guidelines that include addressing the reader with personal pronouns, using active voice, implementing conciseness by limiting modifiers and smothered verbs. I teach you more specifics about these elements in other video lessons. Before I end, I want to make sure you recognize that producing a message in plain language requires more than the right words. The process requires you to talk to or research your target audience before you even begin drafting a message. It also requires that your message be tested. That's the only way to determine whether it actually meets your reader's needs and is usable. The ultimate proof of success is always focused on the reader. That perspective is the most useful one for any expert trying to communicate their expertise in writing.